Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this session on financing a just transition. My name's Ella Stopford-Sackville, and I'm Head of Partnerships of Kite Insights. I'm delighted to be moderating this conversation this afternoon. So it's a big question we're being asked to tackle in 75 minutes. How do we finance a just transition? I'm going to take you on a journey with some amazing speakers, from inspiration to new proposals for how we direct money to where it's needed most. And I'll close with also a fireside chat with an investor working deeply on this work today. So to kick us off, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Tony Juniper. He is the chair of Natural England, and he's been working for decades at the intersection of public policy, science, and engagement on the environmental crisis. He's just published a new book, Just Earth, How a More Equitable World Will Save the Planet. I've actually got that wrong. How a Fairer World Will Save the Planet. And he's going to be sharing some of the insights from that book with us today in this keynote. The Independent paper in the UK called him, by popular consent, the most effective of Britain's eco-warriors. So with that, Tony, over to you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you, Ella, for the very kind introduction and for the opportunity today to share a few reflections from my new book called Just Earth. Now, this book was really derived from 40 years of reflection about the environmental crisis and reaching some rather broad and big conclusions. And perhaps no better place than this magnificent building we're in today to share something about a big idea, because if this building represents anything, it is a very big idea. And that idea, of course, was the Industrial Revolution. Now, that process that began in England 200 years ago, and which is where my book, Just Earth, begins, has shaped our modern world in really quite profound ways. And of course has led to the emergence of a new geological era, which we now call the Anthropocene. Now, the Anthropocene is the manifestation of profound changes taking place in the Earth system. Rapid population growth, rapid economic growth, leading to more pressures on atmosphere, land, ocean, and biodiversity, leading to very serious consequences seen in terms of global heating, and the mass extinction of animals and plants. We've known about this for a very long time, of course, and we have global treaty processes that are trying to find solutions, but they're not working. The extent to which they're not working is demonstrated in this COP curve that I put together. It shows the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere at each of the successive climate change COPs going back to Rio de Janeiro 33 years ago. You can see that we're not making the kind of progress needed. The concentrations are still rising. This invites some very big and important questions in terms of why this might be the case. And in Just Earth, I set out the case for the main reason being why we're not making progress is because of economic and political, racial and gender inequalities. These are the reasons why the environmental crisis is not being solved. There are many layers to why this is the case, and one of them links to the extent to which people who make decisions are very often not the people who are on the receiving end of the consequences. During my time working at Friends of the Earth in England, we discovered that 80% of the most serious pollution is being emitted in the 20% of most deprived neighborhoods. The people breathing in the pollution are not the people who are deciding the policies, the investment, or the spatial planning that's leading to those outcomes. Similarly with transport pollution, much more widespread. If you are poor or if you're a person of color, you are 3 times more likely to have your health affected by health-threatening pollution. And when it comes to the enjoyment of the health benefits of nature, enjoying green spaces, you are much less likely to live in a green and beautiful area if you are poor or if you are not white in many societies. If you're rich, you live somewhere like that. The truth is, ladies and gentlemen, that the people who take the biggest decisions are insulated from the consequences of the way in which we currently pursue economic development. And this is true on the very big issues. This is the Maldives capital, the city of Male. It's one of the lowest lying countries on planet Earth, 1.5 meters above sea level. Already the impacts of climate change are being felt. This is causing the country to spend an increasing proportion of its budget on defensive strategies, sea defenses, desalination plants, at the same time as dealing with the collapse of its coral reef ecosystems. This country faces severe challenges for its very democracy, as more and more of its budget is diverted away from health and education and into dealing with the effects of global warming. These people in the Maldives are not the poorest of the poor. That dubious accolade goes to people living in rural landscapes in many developing countries, including in Africa, whose livelihoods are being hit by drought, causing them to move to cities and sometimes to move across international borders. The effects of drought, storm, and other extreme weather is causing livelihoods to collapse. This is what happened in Syria in 2007, 2010, the most serious drought for at least 2,000 years, caused poor people from rural communities to move to urban centres. When they moved to the urban centres, there was a clash of interests between the rural poor people and the urban elites. This led to protest, it led to political tension, and ultimately it spilled over into civil war. The tragedy that was created in Syria, which has its roots in extreme weather, led to the migration of millions of people across international borders, many of them moving into Europe, traveling west. This had enormous political ramifications, including in my country, where this poster was published just before the European Union exit vote, inviting people to see refugees as a threat to our country, helping to secure a vote to depart from the European Union. That series of connections linked to environmental disaster, fueled by inequality, was nowhere to be seen in the debate. And neither was it to be seen in the debate about what happened in Afghanistan. This is the Hindu Kush Mountains, where until quite recently, snows used to melt very gently in the springtime, watering crops. The snow now melts all at once, causing a flood and then a drought. Drought has led to destitution, and that destitution has led to farmers finding alternative livelihood, including being recruits of the Taliban. A British Army general who I interviewed for Just Earth told me about his research, which revealed how coalition forces were fighting Taliban troops, 90% of whom were refugees from collapsing agriculture linked to climate change. This was rarely, if ever, debated in terms of the Western strategy in that part of the world. And of course, these poor people, whether they're in the Maldives, refugees from agriculture in cocoa landscapes, or whether they are people who are joining into violent movements because they've lost their livelihood, these are not the people producing the greenhouse gas emissions, nor are they the people using up most of the resources that's driving the mass extinction of animals and plants. You can see here, 10% of the people are using up 50% of the CO2. The bottom 50% between them are sharing out 10% of the CO2. And a similar graph could be shown in relation to the consumption of natural resources. This is the backdrop against which international negotiations continue to fail. Biodiversity talks, climate talks. If you go there, you will hear many discussions about technical rules to do with emissions trading, monitoring, verification, reporting, target setting. Rarely is the question of how the pollution and how the resource use is shared out. It's too difficult, and yet we must discuss this if we're going to be able to end poverty and to be able to deal with climate change and other environmental challenges at the same time. This gives you a sense of what you could do if you reallocated the emissions of the 1% of highest emitters. Their pollution is far in excess of what we would need in order to achieve an uplift in poverty removal at a level of $3.2 per capita per day. Their emissions on their own exceed the carbon budget required to do that. We cannot get the breakthroughs we need to get to an equitable climate solution without reallocating some of the environmental impact. Simply does not fit. And these dynamics play out inside nation states. In the United Kingdom, we're struggling to get to sustainable food because people want to protect cheap food. Why do they want to protect cheap food? Because people can't afford food. We're struggling on our climate targets because it's deemed to be too expensive to get to zero carbon power. It's a spurious argument, but it still works. And of course, the solution is not to think about how we redistribute wealth. The idea is to create more wealth via the process of economic growth. And yet this is only exacerbating the problems at hand. Look at this graphic, revealing a survey from United States citizens, estimating what they think is the current level of inequality, what they think would be the ideal inequality, and at the top there, the actual inequality. Note, in relation to the actual inequality, the two quintiles at the bottom of US society, the bottom and second bottom 20% of poorest people, they do not even register on the graphic. Such is the extremes of inequality that are now prevailing in that country. And yet, the solution to this is what? It is more economic growth. It simply isn't working. Growth is powerful in generating well-being, but only up to a certain level does it bring us real human benefit. This graphic shows you that up to about $20,000 of income, you get a real material increase in people's living conditions. Beyond that, the growth is empty. It's not really helping us to solve the problems at hand. And yet we pursue growth at even more extreme levels. Consumerism is its principal vehicle. Buy, buy, buy is the aspiration. We're invited to embrace lifestyles like this, when for many, their lifestyle is like that. This is not talked about. This is actively promoted. And this is one reason why in many societies you see a declining level of trust. People are excluded, they're anxious, they're depressed, and then they get angry, and then when they're angry, this is the bedrock in society for polarization and division, and you can see in your news every single day now how this is panning out in the real world. So what are we going to do about this? Well, in a room that is symbolizing a massive idea, we have to start thinking big. Otherwise, we're not going to fix these problems. So what might we do? We've got to move beyond GDP. We've got to start measuring different things. A genuine progress indicator to replace gross domestic product. We need to transition to purpose-driven companies that are beyond profit and are about actually solving the world's problems. Many businesses aren't doing that. In this room, however, we can see many that are trying to. We need to redirect finance. How do we get capital into places where we're going to actually start to fuel a just transition rather than more ecological destruction? We must tax wealth. There is spectacular wealth in the world today. It's concentrated in a very few hands. That must end. We cannot carry on with that level of disparity. We need to switch the billions of dollars in subsidies that are fueling industrial farming and fossil fuels and move those into the sustainable alternatives. We need to create transition plans for key sectors, fossil fuels, steel, agriculture, amongst them. We need to incentivize sustainable consumption so that people can actually live a good life without breaching ecological limits. Ecological taxes are one way of doing that, shifting the taxation away from income and towards pollution and waste of resources. This can be done. We need to have more rights for people to be able to defend their healthy environment against interests that come in from outside that create the pollution and the ecological destruction. And we need to have laws to protect future generations. All of these ideas presently are stifled by our slavish and unending debate about whether we want left-wing policies or right-wing policies. I've reached the conclusion in Just Earth that neither of these frames of reference are now fit for the situation we face. Communism, capitalism, socialism, none of them are fit for purpose. I propose a new idea, the idea of thrivalism. 10 billion people thriving on a living planet, driven by a different set of ways of generating well-being and allocating the limited environmental space of planet Earth. If we're going to do this and move into a different frame of reference, begin to build a different idea and the momentum needed to actually make it stick, we're going to have to move beyond environmental policy, get into a deeper context, moving beyond environmental science, policy and technologies, thinking about those economic drivers, including the commitment to economic growth, to be thinking about the political drivers that shape outcomes across societies, thinking about how we harness culture to move beyond consumerism and short attention spans, and ultimately to be thinking about the very philosophy that underpins society. Because in the Western world, we have lost contact with how our planet works. Fortunately, there are still societies that possess the indigenous wisdom that used to shape how societies worked. If we can reconnect to that, cascade upwards into how we design the future of our societies, we can have a bright future. But we're not going to do it through superficial, small actions. This requires big change, and that's what I advocate in Just Earth and how a fairer world will save the planet. Thank you so much for listening. It's been my pleasure to be here. Thank you.